week we're going to focus on our fishing net macrame. You're going to want to grab your fishing net macrame kit, and I'm going to take a moment to show you what's in our kit this week. You should have a dowel rod and string in your kit. For this week, you are also going to need tape and a pair of scissors. I have a very special guest, my friend Sarah Thomas, who's with UConn Extension, who's going to take time to show us how to make our fishing net macrame.
So in your kit you have your chopstick and your 5 pieces of yarn or string, and the fishing net macrame that we're creating today is inspired by a Mashantucket Pequot traditional fishing net called a gill net. And so this would sit on top of the water, and we'll make this the top of our net. And on this top of our net we would have pieces of some buoyant material, so cork or something else that would float to the top of the surface of the water. And tied on the bottom of the net would be pieces of something heavier, so maybe a rock or another heavy object to keep the lower part of the net suspended below the surface of the water. And then as the fish come through towards the net, they get caught in the net, and when the indigenous peoples would lift the net up into their canoe, the fish would be effectively caught. So the first part of our fishing net macrame, and macrame just means a series of knots, is we're going to take each of our 5 pieces and we're going to fold them in half. And we want a loop at the top, and we want the tails to be pretty even here, but if they're not exactly even, that's okay, because we have lots of knots to do in the meantime. We are going to put the loop in front of the chopstick, and we are going to thread the ends of the string through our loop, and then we're going to pull tight. So this is called a lark's head knot, and we are going to do 1 lark's head knot with each of our pieces of string. So we're going to fold again, put it in front of the chopstick, take the tails and put them through the hole, and then pull this down. So it's okay if they're a little unevenly spaced when we first get them on, because we'll be able to move them as we keep going. And the Mashantucket Pequots ate a large and diverse variety of local foods, and one of these foods or foodstuffs was fish and seafood. So catching fish was an important part of their culture and their lifestyle and their diet. I have 1 more string. Just going to do 1 more knot. Okay, so now I have all 5 hooked up here, and I'm going to spread them out so that they're evenly spaced. And I do want about 1.5 inches on either side, just so that none of the strings are going to fall off the end of the chopstick. So now that I have that ready, it's easiest to do all the knot tying on the edge of a desk or some other surface, so that you have both hands available to be tying your knots. So I'm just going to tape this down here on either side. So we started out with 5 strings, and now we have 10 tails available to us to knot. So we are going to start with the 2nd string of the first knot and the 1st string of the 2nd knot. And we're going to hold them together so they're parallel, so that means they're running next to each other. And we're going to grasp them here about 3/4 of an inch from the top, and we're going to do an overhand knot. So I'm going to come around here, and I'm going to thread these 2 ends through this hole, and then when I cinch it up and tie it tighter, I want to make sure it ends up creating this little triangle. So now we have created our first overhand knot, we have our first triangle. I'm going to take the 2nd string of the 2nd knot and the 1st string of the following knot, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to fold it over itself, take those tails and pull them through the hole, and I want this knot to end up very close in distance from the chopstick as my first one, so that they're going to go in a straight line all the way across. So we're leaving this first string, and eventually we're going to leave this last string as well, because a gill net is kind of rectangular in nature, so it hangs in the water column pretty evenly. So we want to keep that rectangular shape all the way down. So I'm going to take the second string of my third knot and the first string of my fourth knot, do the same thing. Hold them together, tie an overhand knot, and bring that up so that it sits pretty close in line with the previous knot. I have 3 strings left. I'm going to take this string for my fourth knot and the first string for my last knot, tie my next overhand, and there we go. So you can wiggle them a little bit if you don't tie them that tight. That way you have some room to play with those to get them even. And so in our first row of our net, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 knots and 2 strings. Now we're going to go to the second row. So we're going to take our first string that has not been tied yet, and the first string of our second, this comes from here. So this next following string, and we are going to tie an overhand knot again. But we want to it's going to look like that. So we want to keep about the same amount of string as we did in our first with our second. So, and I don't want to pull this over here too much because then we lose our shape, and I don't want to pull this over here because then we lose our triangle shape. So kind of keep it at a natural level and natural spacing here. And this is going to be about 1.5 inches from the top of our chopstick, but it's going to be about 3/4 of an inch from our first knot in our first row. So we're going to hold those together. We're going to do our overhand knot. And we're going to pull it up so that the spacing is pretty much the same. If it's a little bit different or a little bit off, that's okay. And if we have any loose string that's kind of hanging there, we can tighten up the knot a little bit. But it doesn't have to be perfect because we're just going for that overall look. So we're going to take this string that's kind of hanging from our first knot, and we're going to take the first string from the second knot in our first row, and we're going to do another overhand knot. And we're going to continue the same pattern of knotting all the way down this row. And you'll notice that these rhombus shapes are forming. They look like diamonds. And if they're not perfect, that's okay. It can be a little confusing once you have lots of knots that you're playing with, but you can kind of see these horizontal lines that are forming. So we're working on our second horizontal line or our second row. Okay, now I have 2 strings that I haven't tied yet, one of which is the very last string. So we're going to do the same type of knot as we did up here. We want to keep this straight, and we want a triangle to form with this knot. And we want it to be the same level as all of the other knots in this row. So we have just completed our first 2 rows. Our first row had 4 knots in it, and our second row had 5 knots in it. So we're going to continue this pattern of alternating row 1 and row 2 all the way down until we have very little string left. And we want to end on a row that has 5 knots in it so that we don't have any string hanging here without being tied up. So you can continue to tie. You're going to repeat. Row 3 is going to look the same as row 1. So you're going to leave this string hanging here, and you're going to take the second string of your first knot and the first string of your second knot, tie another overhand knot. This is where it gets a little bit tricky because all the strings are going different places, and you want to keep that same amount of yarn or string as you have been, so about 3/4 of an inch. And you can just continue that all the way down your macrame. Just as a reminder, this third row will have 4 knots in it and 2 of these loose strings. So now I'm going to start row number 4, which is going to look the same as row number 2. So row number 4 had 5 knots in it, so we have a row of 4, 5, 4, and 5. And you'll notice that these strings down here are getting a little bit uneven, and they're getting a lot shorter as we use up that string length in our knots. So I think I'm going to try to do 2 more rows. We'll see if I'm able to get there. I don't think I will have enough to end with a row number 4, so I'm actually going to take this knot out and just leave it as is. If you wanted to recreate this craft with longer string or longer yarn, you could absolutely do that. Because I don't have enough to keep going, but I have a lot left, I'm just going to take my scissors and I am going to trim a little bit so that they're even. And if you are going to trim, you don't want to get too close to your knots because you could end up cutting too much and then they would fray. That's pretty close to even. So this is a miniature version of a traditional Mashantucket Pequot fishing net.